Well, thank you, Tuesday, and thank you, Tim, for being with me here today. The opportunity to get together and talk about shared work and collaborative leadership for systemic change is an honor to do with both of you. And today I'm in the Borderlands area of southern Arizona and northern Sonora, Mexico. And part of the intention for getting together with you today to explore shared work is really arising out of a need that I'm seeing in my work, both here in the Borderlands and with international groups working on collaborative leadership, systemic change, educational innovation, and practicing methods and methodologies that can support creating a shared future that works for not only us as individuals and our work, but also for the biosphere. So there's a variety of questions that I'm sitting with in my work and that a lot of my friends and colleagues are, and the organizations that I'm working with. And so I'd like to share a couple of very broad questions to just sort of frame the conversation we're going to have today. And then happy to sort of chime in as we go in exploring shared work. So the first question that I wanted to just sort of throw out there for us to consider is probably more broad than it needs to be. But the question I'm sitting with is, given the accelerating, exponential, and complex ecological, cultural, and economic challenges and opportunities of the 21st century, how can we cultivate personal, social, and systemic leadership through integrous shared work and collaboration that truly addresses the challenges of our times and optimizes our relationships toward our collective potential? And so, understandably, as a very broad question, it incorporates a lot, but the intention for me in the conversation today is, how do we go from these broad, epic challenges and opportunities we're facing and then hone into, well, how do we practice and prototype the future that we want to create? And how do we do that when our and our mates' lives and livelihoods and human legacy is on the line on a day-to-day level? And with that, in context where it really matters, like in the Borderlands, and you have life and death struggles organizationally and culturally all the time, how do we actually joyfully participate in doing our shared work when it matters? And then the final framing question that I have is, what are the stories or what are the ways of being and thinking and acting that we can practice through our shared work that allows us to make contributions at a scale that matters? So those are the kinds of questions that I'm personally exploring in my work. And in organizations around the world, I'm noticing that people are exploring, playing with, struggling with similar questions that are about how do we create relationships and how do we innovate culturally through our shared work in a way that really makes healthy, happy contributions at these varying scales. So that's kind of what's on my mind. And, just again, thank you very much for exploring all this with me today.
Yeah, happy to. Thank you, Joshua. It's really, those are great questions. And I was thinking about, the idea that really good questions stay with you and can't be answered like right away, but you kind of live into them, right? And I just feel like there's something about, I have both, I think we can give some of our insight and perspective, and I just want to say, like, I can't wait to hear what your folks do with this information as they live into it, right? Like, there's something too really about that.
And the shared work itself is an inquiry.
Yeah.
It's a question. It's a question that, how do we work across difference over time? This is by no means an answer.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Like, this is the inquiry, and what you're articulating is like a huge piece of that. And so it's almost like, well, let's just dig into that inquiry together and see what turns up that might be useful for all of us and whoever gets to watch the webinar.
Yeah. 'Great. Tim, do you want to pop up the slides?
Absolutely.
All right. So just so we all know, we're here for the same thing. We're here to talk about shared work and collaborative leadership for systemic change, right? Like that's what we're about, right? Like just, some of the questions that Joshua just teed up for us. That's what we're going to dive right into and explore and be an inquiry together about today. Super simple agenda for what we're going to do today. We just had the framing. Ooh, that's bright orange on my screen. I don't know if it is on anyone else's, but it is on mine. We're going to talk about the name. I'm on a new screen that's apparently shared work and collaborative leadership. We're going to talk about that. And then we're going to move into a conversation. It's a little bit of a QA with Joshua, but really we want to just be in conversation and we'll wrap up. So that's just how the webinar will run today. And so let's just dive right in, shall we, Tim?
Yeah.
So one of the things we wanted to talk about first, and Tim and I are just going to kind of go back and forth, and as we do this, you'll get to see a little bit of our style. We want to talk first about why this particular model, and just to say that this model came about as a very pragmatic model. I was working with groups who were working on kind of some of this large scale change, and we kind of kept getting stuck, right? We kept getting stuck, and sometimes we were stuck on what was the vision we wanted, or sometimes we were stuck on what was the analysis to provide to this particular kind of question, right? As if there was kind of like one vision or one analysis, and if we could just like agree on it, then we could get to work. And this model kind of began to appear to me as I was working with groups who managed to move past that stuckness, right? And so they began to see like it wasn't actually about having an end goal that we could all agree on or an end way to get there, but that actually what we could do is just get started together. And so this model is about taking the next step together that you can see, to begin to build action, to build success, to build momentum, to maybe sometimes get to a shared vision or a shared aspiration or a shared analysis, but truly to get to some of what you talked about, Josh, which was like making change in the system, right? Like just getting to work. Tim, anything there?
Well, yeah, I mean, just like, when you were framing those questions, Joshua, you were talking about the kind of like 21st century context, and it's like, and for me, the increasing levels of chaos, societal, cultural, environmental breakdown and disruption, like they're not going away, right? Then like there's no point on the other side where suddenly it's all going to feel we're not going to get through this. Maybe our children's children or grandchildren, I don't know how far down the line, but I know I'm not going to see the other side, right? So we have to be in the question of how do we work together across difference over time. Like we're not going to solve this by having a good event or running a good conference or hosting a really excellent 3-day retreat together, right? Though those are important pieces of any strategy. I'm not saying that, but this question of like, how do we figure this out over time, for me is critical, right? Because we're going to be in this for a while. We're not going to get through this, right? There's no finish line we're going to cross, right? So it's exciting to really get into that, and I'm aware that collaboration. I mean, it's everywhere. Everyone's talking about it. It's this almost a fad. Engagement and collaboration and innovation. And there's something about this model to me that really invites people into the practice, which is very, very different than being in the kind of like, oh, let's collaborate and make it a fad. I mean, this invites us into the quality of, relationship that actually allows us to begin to secure next steps when we're working together across this kind of differences that Tuesday was speaking to. So I'm excited to get going.
That's right. And just to say, so Joshua's going to be here asking questions and hopefully helping you make it relevant. But I would just say kind of at this moment, Tim and I may or may not be working in contexts that are similar to what folks who are listening are working in. And so the invitation is to please translate this into your environment. What would work there? What makes sense there? This isn't dogma or orthodoxy that you have to do it in exactly the way we're talking about it. We want you to use this in a way that's responsive to the place you are. And so if you need to do a little translation, or if you're thinking, oh, I don't think I could quite do it where I am, but I could try this, like that's what we're up to.
It's a map, right? Don't confuse it with the landscape. But I do think anyone who's trying to do anything significant right now is faced with the fundamental challenges of working across difference and sustaining that work over time. Like, I do think that is like a pattern, you know. I mean, we have the privilege of working in so many different contexts and sectors with different people in many different parts of North America and Europe. And so I think that's there are patterns, and this model has arisen out of multiple contexts too, right?
That's right.
Yeah. That's right.
So this next slide is one of my favorite quotes ever. It's the most effective way to do it is to do it. I just like for me, it feels like there's such wisdom in those particular words. It's like, we have to get started. And I think sometimes the urgency of our times can actually paralyze us or ask us to pause too much. Now, let me be really clear. I'm not talking about action without reflection. But I am saying that we do sometimes have to jump in and figure it out as we go, right? Lots of different words. This building the bridge as we walk it, flying the, building the plane as we fly it, all those different things. We have to get started. And so this particular picture is a group of folks in Madison, Wisconsin. And these folks just had a sense that something needed to happen differently in their city. There'd just been, how these reports come out in cities around equity and difference. And their city had just been named kind of one of the most racist places in the US to live, right? And so these folks just cared about getting something done, but they had no idea where to start. And so, and they had all of these great ideas about initiatives they could do and how to get started, and nothing all of their ideas were kind of leading them to spin their wheels. And so what we said is, what's the next thing in front of you? What can you see that you can do together? And one of the things they could see, frankly, to do together was to begin to build their relationships. That actually, if they wanted to take on race in their city, they needed to be in cross-racial relationship with each other. And so they just started meeting with each other. And then they saw something they could do, small things, right? Small things. And they just started kind of doing them together. And so within a year, they had a police-involved shooting, as many U.S. cities have had. And as they were doing and seeing the next step, one of the things they saw is that perhaps they could do something around police-involved shootings and race in their community. And so they called a series of conversations with police and community that were pretty radical and revolutionary for their city. But 6 months before that, they could not have seen that that's what they were going to do. They took on one of the toughest issues kind of facing us right now in the US, and they didn't even know they were going to do that last year. And so it was one of those great stories of like, just be in a relationship, just see the next step, and you might be able to do some really significant things.
Yeah, I love that. It's like do you know that quote, the opposite of despair is not hope, it's action, right? Right, you heard that. So it's like, there's like the greatest antidote to overwhelm is action, because you begin, even if it's a small step, you begin to feel like you're beginning to have some influence over the circumstance you're in. You're not just completely lost to it. It's interesting to use. I was thinking also about, I've been doing some work around municipalities here in Nova Scotia and the modernization of municipalities. And like, we've had the research since 1949 saying that we need municipal reform in Nova Scotia since 1949, right? And then since then, a whole series of reports have come out all saying the same thing, that we need municipal reform, right? But nothing has happened. People have not moved until finally now, folks are beginning to start taking responsibility and beginning to do something about it. So I think this it's time for action is really true. I just saw Christiana Figueres speak in Paris at this Carbon Soil conference, and she was just like, swallow the alarm clock, people. Like, we cannot sit around analyzing anymore, right? We've got 3 years to see a downturn in the amount of carbon in the atmosphere. 3 years, or it is likely the global temperature will go above 2 degrees. And so there's something about this, like, the first thing that instilled in me was some sense of panic. And then I was like, right, well, I guess I just better take the next step. You know what I mean? And so it's like, okay, how do we move? So yeah.
So here is, this next slide is basically the model we're going to talk through today. And so this is called the shared work model. You'll see shared work is at the center, right? And that the idea is that the work is what brings us together. And frankly, that we have work to do. And so the question is really, what are we willing to do together, right? Like, what's the next step we're willing to take? And that I think sounds like it makes sense. But it's actually a pretty significant departure from what do we see our future being and how do we move there, right? Which might be a place that we tend to start. Or how do we analyze this problem? What does it tell us about what we should do? And then move there. I think there is a good place for having good analysis and good data and even some shared sense of future. I think that all of that's helpful. And frankly, at times the groups I'm working with, that's not any place they can start. They're too disparate, right? And we need all of that difference and all of those different perspectives to move forward, right? So the idea is actually not to lump us in together because we've got different work we have to be in and have to do and need to be doing it differently from each other. But the challenge is what's the work in front of us and what are we willing to do about it? And so that's why we have work at the center here. And you'll see along the outside, there are different circles that have shared purpose. What I appreciate about this particular piece is we can say we have shared work to do and we can move that work and we can still keep our individual and organizational purpose, right? That is still valid. It still may be what you need to do, but it doesn't necessarily dominate what our shared work is. So for me, there's a bit of kind of good relationship between having personal purpose, having organizational purpose, but coming together for that work that needs us to come together and act a bit differently. And so this keeps the work at the center, not kind of in a vision or analysis. It kind of says that there's not one way forward, which is often kind of what keeps us stuck, right? Trying to find that right way, either to get to that one vision or that right analysis. So this for me liberates us to take action. In a lot of ways. And so that's kind of the main thrust of the model. What are we willing to do? Let's take the next step together. Let's identify that. And then we've identified, and we'll go through here in just a few minutes, 5 stances that groups we've been working with hold to be able to work together over time when they're wildly different from each other, right? So there are things that sometimes as a leader I have to hold or as a facilitator, and then the group can hold, but there are 5 kind of really important stances that help us move shared work.
So there's something, I mean, Zaid Hassan's done a bunch of talks a lot about this, but the whole idea that predictive strategic planning now is kind of a complete waste of time because the world is changing so rapidly that we can't do that. So when you're talking about the difference between kind of like shared work, which is like, where is there shared need that brings us together to collaborate versus creating some kind of vision or strategic plan, it's like outrageous amounts of money just gets wasted on strategic plans that are obsolete within 6 months, right? I mean, and so I think that's a huge piece of it. So if we can acknowledge we're in this quality of uncertainty that we're organizing in the midst of that, then it really becomes like, oh, we actually need to begin to start collaborating with each other. That's the only way we're going to get through this, because we can't say where we're going to go and then and then someone just can't like direct us to go there anymore. We actually have to be figuring it out as we move. So I think that piece is really important. And so this whole collaboration thing that we keep coming back to, and that you framed us around, Joshua, I think is important. And I just want to say, just before we kick off, that like collaboration or engagement like isn't inherently good. Like, it's not an inherently good thing. It doesn't like inherently produce the best of human potential, you know. Like we, Chuz and I have been in conversation with a guy in Ireland, and he was at an art of hosting also, and he was talking about the participatory processes we were learning, and was like, people have used these processes to plan violence. They're probably planning violence within 2 miles of us right now to go get it done. So it's like, but I often feel like collaboration gets touted as this answer to like solve the problems. And it's not that collaboration is inherently good. And that's why these stances are so important, right? Because these stances create the practices within collaboration, right, that increase the chances of us getting to results that arise out of a diversity of perspectives and opinions, right? They aren't ruled by one particular way of doing things, right? And so I think that's just like an essential piece to coming up with solutions, like you were saying in the opening, Joshua, that serve both people and our biosphere, right? I mean, I think we consistently fail to get solutions that serve people in our biosphere when one perspective is ruling the roost, right? Mm-hmm. And so this these stances are important because they create the container for collaboration to produce things that truly serve people, that truly serve context, that can begin to serve future generations and the planet that we're living on.
One of the questions that I have about the central space of shared work is that if, in the midst of increasing complexity, one of the reasons, therefore, to focus on systemic change or systemic leadership or change leadership would be that in increasing complexity, we can't do it by ourselves. And so therefore collaboration would be a method or a tool or an approach to be able to come together and address these very complex and accelerating challenges, but also opportunities that we have. And so one of the things that I love about the idea of having shared work in the center is that it allows potentially for people to build trust together in their shared work by taking action. Exactly. Rather than by planning action or thinking about it or whatever. So if one isn't going to do, for example, vision building to start or purpose building to start, how does a group or multiple stakeholders identify the shared work that they want to just start taking action on to begin with?
I think that's a really good question. And I want to say a couple things before I kind of get to that, Joshua, because I think that, yes, most of the problems we're facing, like we kind of intuitively know we can't solve them on our own. Like most folks will like, yeah, that's probably true. And yet when we get into rooms together, we insist on some convergence when we're collaborating that just doesn't help us. And part of what I like about these stances is it actually acknowledges that collaboration is challenging. Collaboration doesn't always feel good, right? And what can keep us together is like some sense of moving forward and work, right, when things get hard. And so I think there are a couple of things that, and Tim, I'd love to hear your ideas too. I find that the groups need to go through some kind of looking at need together without collapsing into kind of a shared analysis or a shared vision, or there's some urgency driving the need for shared work. So I did some work in Detroit several years ago around transforming the food system. And, it was 60 different stakeholders, all the way from folks who were land developers to folks who believed that capitalism was the root of all evil, right? So these folks were never going to come together in terms of like how they thought about the problem. And we spent some time exploring what was up. Right? And they didn't have to agree what was up. We did interviews, we did learning journeys, and then we simply said, what are we willing to do together? Right? So it was a way of, we did some sensing, if you'd like to use that word, around need and what was happening, but without collapsing into a singular piece. And then frankly, we needed to know what those 60 people were willing to do. Whatever was a good idea or best practice or learn from a TED Talk was only as useful as people willing to implement it, right? And so we needed the group to say together what they were willing to do. And so sometimes that's the question, right? Like, oh, we've got all this information about what's happening. We've done some exploring together. What makes sense as a place for us to start? And not a place to start, but the 6 or 7 places to start. What are the prototypes we're going to do? Whatever, So I think asking the direct question around what we want to do is a great place to start. And sometimes, of course, there'll be parameters in a project that are just given, right? That are just like the shared work in a moment. We might talk about this homelessness redesign we did. The parameter was like, we need to redesign our homelessness system. That was actually enough to get started. Right? We didn't have to have a shared, which we were never going to get to a shared vision. But the parameter of the design was we've got to redesign the system. That was the shared work. Tim, what do you got?
Yeah, totally. And so if I just think here, just where I live now in Lunenburg County, what happened for us was that like this really massive piece of research was done across our region, and it came out, and it was really shocking in terms of the kind of like social and economic precipice we were on. The report itself was called Now or Never, right? And so it sent all these shockwaves through the province. And as a result, you know, a bunch of 5 business leaders got together and said, we have to do something, you know, but no one knew what to do. And so, like, I think part of the shared work is discovering what to do. But I haven't been in a place where there hasn't been some kind of circumstance, something that has drawn people of disparate perspectives together. The same thing we're doing in the forestry sector here. You know, we've got people in the room who are suing each other, you know, 18 months ago, now figuring out things in the forestry sector in Nova Scotia because the circumstance demands it. We're seeing the collapse of the sector, and as a result, the collapse of rural communities, right? And like, it's so vivid for people that it just draws them into those conversations. And I love what you're saying, Hughes, because there's something about this isn't about agreement. It's actually in disagreement that we learn, right? Or not even in disagreement, but in conversation from disagreeing perspectives that we learn, right? And if we're not learning, we're not actually adapting. And if we can accept we're in a world that is under constant rapid change, which I believe we are, that's my experience, and you know, that seems to be the reality we're working in. If we're not learning, we're not able to adapt to the changing circumstances around us. So we've got to think that actually encountering perspectives and people and having disagreement is an essential ingredient to learning, and therefore essential ingredient to like living, responding, and getting change done in today's world, right? So it's so I think that's one of the big drivers for me. Like, it's just the reality. You know what I mean? Like, if we want to actually get good work done in the world, we've got to figure this out. We've got to figure out how to get along enough, right? And have dignified conversations so we can learn and then adapt and then take action together.
Great. Shall we move into the stances, Tim? All right. So we talked about the stances, right? These things that groups that we've been in become almost culture of the group, or and often I'll just say it's the leader or the facilitator who needs to hold these at the beginning. The group can adopt them and get there, but often just to kind of name that it's often we're bringing this to groups of people who are trying to work across difference over time. And the first stance is that relationship is a resolution, a relationship as resolution, right? That actually the work that we're doing is important enough that we need to stay in relationship around it. Kind of the work supersedes some of the things that would have us just be out, right? So we're in groups all of the time, or I'm in groups all the time, where if you don't have the same analysis or you don't have the same vision, it's like, I can't work with you, right? This stance says I have to work with you, right? And that there isn't a finish line, right? Like there's no way, we can't throw people away, right? We're in the same communities, we're in the same world, right? That we have to stay in it. And so that sometimes we come up across issues that will not be resolved conceptually or theoretically or ideologically. And the resolution is actually staying in relationship, right? That actually that's what the resolution is in that moment. So for example, in the Detroit work, we were looking again at transforming the food system, lots of really different voices in that system. And one participant was a young Black woman farmer. And we were, the iceberg exercise, right? Where we're talking about root cause and things like that. And she says, well, we have to talk about race as we're talking about food and food security. And an older white farmer says, well, let me just, tell you this. And he happens to quote one of our very conservative Supreme Court justices, which, would not support race being a important factor. And the room kind of went quiet, right? And it was like, this could be a make or break moment. Are we going to deal with race? Or are we not going to deal with race, right? And even if we were going to deal with race, like, were we going to fix it in the 6-hour bit of time together? Right? Probably not. And so we got through the moment by kind of like pulling back to our principles about like, if it's important to someone, it's important, right? And so we're going to put it up on the wall, and we don't have to be in agreement about its importance, but it's going to be present in the room. And during the break, that older white farmer went over to the young Black farmer and sat down with her and said, I think I have something to learn from you, right? And you can see she took a deep breath, like, and then she went in and she talked to him and they had a conversation. I do not believe they agreed on the role of race in the food system at the end of that conversation. But what they did is they stayed in relationship, right? They were able to be in the group together, and they were able to keep working it. And so their relationship was a resolution. And I don't want to get into too many details, but just to say, even if that farmer had not been able to be, the younger farmer had not been able to stay in a relationship, there were people kind of waiting, right? Like she could have said, nope, I'm not here. And there would have been people who would have stepped in and had that conversation with the older gentleman. It wasn't her responsibility to do, but it was really wonderful that she did. And their being in relationship and the group seeing that they stayed in relationship was hugely transformative for the rest of the work.
Yeah, for me, there's a direct correlation between the relationships you build and the results you can achieve, you know, when you're working in a collaborative space. It's as simple as that, right? So when the shit hits the fan, do people turn away and leave each other stranded, or do they turn in and work with each other? And if they turn in and work with each other, they build trust and they build a capacity to work in an inherently uncertain context, right? And not only an inherently uncertain context of like whatever the work is, but also the relationships of being with people who you don't necessarily agree with, right? And so I think this, like, you know, the quality of relationships we build with each other is going to impact the results we're going to be able to achieve. It's quite as simple as that. And then I think there's also something for me. Choose. Oh, my thought just went completely out of my head. I'll have to come back to it.
All right.
You know, ever happen?
Totally happens. I got a question though, so maybe
Yeah,
I can. Yeah. So, you know, when I first experienced this model with you two at the Beyond the Basics AOH in Kingston, this particular stance was one of the ones that really inspired me to go deeper in exploring what does it mean to do shared work. And as a result of that, and with you guys writing that post about protopia, or shared work, and so taking action that makes each day a little bit better than the day before, and staying in relationship was really the root of that, like the feeling for me that continues to resonate, is that whole idea of relationships being the dojo of the 21st century, and that they need to be if we're going to make it through together towards, you know, doing good shared work in a meaningful way. And so there's a part of it for me where, you know, it sounds like it makes obvious sense to me that there is no such place as a way, and therefore we have to be in relationship. And at the same time, the question I sit with is how do we cultivate the ways of being together that allow us to stay in relationship when things get really hard?
Yeah. I mean, I don't think there's any better way to do it than to do it. I mean, I literally don't have a better answer than that, you know? And so, of course, there's processes you can put in place. You know, this whole like shifting of leadership from being, I have the answer, to creating the conditions to be in relationship and figure it out. So we're talking about a fundamental shift in leadership in terms of how we're turning up to problem solve, right? Moving from like a command and control, I've got it figured out, everybody follow me, right? Which doesn't work in a highly uncertain world, to one where we're creating the conditions for people to come together. But I don't know any other way to learn how to work in relationship than to work in relationship, right? And I just want to say that, like, and this was what I was kind of forgot to say earlier, is like, you know, my experience is people don't like the idea that there isn't resolution.
Yes.
People do not like this idea. They don't like the idea that that like it can't be solved and it won't ever happen again, right? And so I think that's a huge part of this, is like there's some, like, not only how do we cultivate capacities to be in relationship, but like how do we really begin to start cultivating the capacity to let go of the need for it to be sorted, right? To let go of the need for it to be done and wrapped up and tied up in a little bow and everybody just to feel comfortable and great about it. Thank goodness. It's like, thank goodness the Networks episode is over and that was a happy ending, you know? It's like, actually, that's not the reality we're in. So like, how do we not only, you know, how do we learn to, you know, be in the uncomfort of that? And, you know, there's all these personal practices that people are developing for that, but also how do we do that together? How do we stay in that uncomfort together? With, you know, knowing there may not be a resolution. We may not be alive to see the other side of this, right? If there's even another side. I mean, I don't know.
You know, I don't know that I have much to add from what you just said, Tim, except that I found that it's a little bit of a closed loop, but when people start getting results because of being in a relationship, they're more likely to stay in relationship too. So that's another piece that,
totally. Yeah.
That supports having work at the center. Because when you say, when you see I've stayed in it, you know, and we got good results, and then I'm more likely to stay in it. So there's a little bit of like risk and just giving it a go.
Yeah.
It becomes a little self-perpetuating. But I think until you articulate clearly that relationships and results are not, that they're inextricably linked, it can be a hard sell for folks, right? And you know, but and I think it might be slightly different in smaller communities where we know, like, you don't get to just walk away. You have to see the person at your next meeting, right? And so often I'll actually bring that to people. Like, most of us have to see the same people, right? So let's like stay in it. Let's figure out a way to be in relationship with each other. Let's figure out, you know, and so sometimes, like I said, this is a stance that you as a leader have to hold, and sometimes it's worth articulating, right? So it's not a surprise to people, or they don't think we get to bail, or those kind of things too.
And it's not just results choose, right? It's that people see themselves in the results. Yeah. But the whole piece of a collaborative process, like collaboration is as successful as whether people who are being engaged in the process, who are engaged in the process, see themselves reflected in the results, right? This isn't like, we got a result because so-and-so got it done for us, right? It's like, do I see myself? Do I feel ownership of that? Do I feel like that's something we've created together? And if I do, then that radically changes my desire to be in it again, right? For the next cycle of whatever it might be. That's a big piece. And I think there's also something in it. We don't have to go into this now because I know, you know, we need to move on, but I think there's something here about relationship to place that is important, right? Like, you know, building ongoing relationships to place and to nature and to like physical environments around us. I think that is a big piece of this, you know. And then also this idea that, you know, relationships are something that we are building, if you know, up and down hierarchies as well as across networks. And that, you know, often when we think about, you know, relationship and engagement and collaboration, we think about that as a flat thing. But actually, I feel like this is a very deliberate, you know, when we talk about this, we very deliberately talk about this as going up and down the vertical line as much as along the horizontal one. Yeah.
Tim, do you want to take us into two? I feel like I've started a lot of these. Do you want to start with inquiry?
Yeah. So inquiry is answer. So I mean, sorry, it's curiosity. I like it. So the root of this for me is that answers don't work in inherently uncertainly, rapidly changing, information saturated contexts, right? It's like, so I find that if we can begin to start cracking questions at the heart of our work, that then begins to drive it in a completely different way than if we're striving to get to a certain answer or striving to convince people that we've got the right answer already before we've even started, right? So this inquiry as answer, this ability to stay in the curiosity, right, means that you're able to adapt and learn as you move rather than, right, berate yourself for failing to get to the place where you said you should have got 6 months ago, but is actually no longer relevant, right? So I think there's a significant change of focus here in terms of like thinking about inquiry as the answer to the challenge. And then you know, I always think about this. A buddy of mine said this to me a few weeks ago. He's like, have you noticed that like people who are learning just seem to be happier? You notice that? Like they're not stuck. There's something about like being in learning that gives you a feeling of some kind of fulfillment, of some kind of like joy and curiosity in life, you know? Like I remember the teachers at school, right, who had stopped learning and were just like downloading on me now. Like my, my French teacher, I remember him, you know, it was like, he obviously didn't enjoy teaching anymore. And as a result, none of us enjoyed he wasn't curious about French anymore. But my history teacher, Mr. Woods, like we all loved it because he was just like conveyed that hunger for learning. You know, he was still so curious about it. And he wasn't teaching us the facts. He was teaching us the curiosity about history and about our lineage, right, on our island. And so that quote, right, it may be that when we no longer know what to do, we have come to our real work. And when we no longer know which way to go, we have begun our real journey. It's like, that's the point of entry, where collaboration begins to become possible. Because when I don't know, I have to ask for help. I need to invite others in. And if I don't have that as a fundamental stance, I'm fundamentally not open to collaboration. I'm not open to asking for help, right?
Let's keep going. I'm just aware of timing, Tim.
Okay.
So that's great. So the third stance is around looking at all levels all the time. And this really responds to when we think about what we'd like to do, often we get stuck at what we think the level of change is, right? And so we want to work on a systemic level, right? And so all of our efforts are going there. Or we think we need to work on the team level, organizational level, right? And so this particular model talks about trying to at least be aware of all levels all the time. That at any place that we decide to do a prototype or an intervention, we're going to impact and be impacted by the other levels. And so it's actually quite important. This is Grace Lee Boggs, who talks about that, and she was a real trailblazer in equity in the States here. And she talks about that we have to make the spiritual leap of transforming the world by transforming ourselves. Right? And so that there is a deeply personal aspect to systems level change, that we cannot ignore that. We can't expect to change all of the conditions outside of us without changing what's inside of us. And I would say that this, for me, is one of the places when I'm working with leaders, we talk about all of the time. Most of us can talk about all the things we want to change outside. But don't necessarily, and I'm most of us, but don't necessarily want to talk about what's the change we actually need to have inside as well. And so that when we talk about all levels all the time, when we're making decisions about what's our shared work, we're thinking about what does that mean for us personally? What does it mean in my organization and team? What does it mean to the system? You know, if that's our level of intervention. And then structurally, we're talking about those larger structures. So if we have the education system, kind of culture or race or class or gender are the structures that are kind of across systems. So that's when we talk about structural work. That's what we're talking about. And so we can make strategic choices about what level we'd like to experiment with, but we can't forget the other levels or we've missed something. We can't get fooled that simply being on one level is going to get us to where we need to go. And so when we talk about all levels all the time, I would also say for me, this is a real accessibility issue because people come from different perspectives on what level's important to them or where they have energy around or where they have juice around, and that can be cultural. And so by allowing all levels of work or considering all levels of work or thinking through all levels, we actually make our work more accessible because different groups will be able to access in different ways.
Love it. Yeah, it's all levels all the time. It's like, just design for it. Don't pretend it's one or the other. So for me, it's like, when I'm designing something, I'm thinking it like with these municipalities work, I'm thinking about the individual leaders. We're thinking about how not only the people, but the organizations are relating to each other, right? What's the systemic impact? So for me, it's a real design, when we're designing these collaborative or participatory processes, this, thinking about this enormously helps my ability to design and hopefully increase the chances of success we might have.
Well, and one of the things that I just want to check in with you about the third one is, so oftentimes, right, personal development or human potential is put in its own sphere, and then leadership is in another sphere, or sustainability is in a different sphere. And for me, I've been cultivating a practice in work about bringing them together. But at the same time, for a lot of groups, the kind of deeper cathartic work that can take place in human potential or personal development spheres is not necessarily the expectations or even desires of an organization or a group of organizations coming together. So there's something about getting more radical about convening or designing spaces that really bring in the deeper personal side and the social, ecological, systemic, in a way that allows us to really practice this all levels all the time. So I just wonder about, in the art of invitation, really, and design, what thoughts do you have on how to best create those spaces where people feel ready and willing to dive into all levels all the time in a way that would really make it meaningful to do so?
So one of my responses, Joshua, I think that that's really great. So I work with a leadership cohort that we actually do interviews ahead of time and share that with folks. And actually we are going to be talking about the movement. We're going to be talking about us interpersonally, and we're going to be talking about you and your personal growth and your lead. Then that's part of the onboarding. I would say that feels kind of like best case scenario when you can get it. That's not always the situations that I'm in. And so then, if we're here to do some work together, I think for me, connecting or making explicit that connection between the personal work and the work we're here to do, if it's interpersonal or systemic or structural, like sometimes that actually needs to be verbalized or made explicit. And I think linked too, right? So that somehow, and linked in terms of like, sometimes we'll ask, I'm thinking, Tim, we've asked the question around like, what do I need to let go of in my leadership? Super simple, right? To make this project go, or to make this work, sustainable, or to make this work possible. And so people are sometimes that's a door in, right? The work is the door into that personal work. I'll be willing to do some personal work if I don't think it's just because you want me to do it, but if I see how it furthers the work.
Absolutely. It's not for the sake of it. It's not like, it's like, we're not talking about collaboration because it's a nice thing to do. We're not talking about doing personal work because it's a nice thing to do. We're talking about it because the circumstance demands it, right? Like status quo is not an option. Like the world is changing around us at incredible pace. And so it's like if we don't do our personal work, we're not going to be able to keep up with it. We will quite literally become obsolete, right? And that would be true of our organizations. Like, Senge's quote, "Learn or die," is for real. And he was talking about organizations, but you can apply it at any level here in terms of, how our species is working or how our communities are working, right? And so I think this, if there's the one kind of quote is like, the amount of change I'm willing to go through inside of myself is going to be relative to the amount of change I'm going to be able to be part of or lead with others, And like, for me, that's like a hard and fast rule of this work. And there's very few things that like, feel like rules or laws, but they're like, if there's a law of systems change and collaborative leadership, like that's one for me, and sometimes, and it's not all, you don't always start there,
right.
but that's like that's like a theme through and through. The people who aren't willing to go through personal change aren't successful in leading change, full stop, and if you're not successful in leading change in the world right now, you're quite simply not a successful leader, because we live in a world that is permeated by change.
And I think not to put too fine of a point on it, we need to be accessible and responsive here. Certain cultures, that personal work, if we start there, is a deal breaker.
Yeah, right, exactly.
So, in some collective, so I want to make sure that the importance of the personal work is really underscored, right? Like that's a non-negotiable. How you get to it needs to be culturally relevant, right? And responsive to the group of people that you're with. There are just some cultures that are based in collectivity that's a hard ask. And when we ascend the personal work too quickly, it just doesn't meet them where they are. So. Right.
And so it's having a process that allows for all kinds of different cultures to find their way into the personal work. So when you've got corporations in the same room as ENGOs, in the same room as governments, in the same room as community organizations and faith organizations, all working on an issue, like people have to be able to find their own ways into the personal work. And it's not that any one group gets to decide this is how we're all going to do it, And it's like, as a facilitator, that's the challenge. Like these are the leadership questions of our time that there aren't simple answers to.
So let's keep going. I'm aware that we're doing a terrible job keeping the teach short. So,
sorry, buddy.
No, we're doing the best we can. So number 4 is seeking multiplicity, to invite the whole person. So when we talk about multi-stakeholder gatherings or getting work together done with people across time, we need to, if we're in it for the long haul, we need to invite the whole person in, right? And so finding ways to allow a person's differences to show up, right? Often we invite folks to our efforts because of what they represent, either organizationally or identity-wise or perspective-wise. And I think, representation is important, and I wouldn't argue with that. I think that what we're asking for, though, is a deeper invitation to the whole person in. And so how do you make it so that the contradictions in myself can show up in the room, right? So I always say, I'm a partner and a mother and a business owner and a runner. And how do those are just like 5 of my 89 different identities, right? And so how do we invite those different pieces of people into the room so that they don't show up from one perspective and then begin to defend that perspective? That's what happens, right? When we invite the whole person into the room, they can say, well, today, this part of me feels this way, and next week I might show up and feel a different way. Like, we allow people to change and be different, and therefore, right, we can get different ideas and perspectives and ways of working together done when we invite the whole person in that we can't when we just invite representation. Representation invites digging in. Whole person invitation invites nuance and complexity and relationship, right? Like, most of us in any relationship we're in, we know that we're not just relating to one aspect of a person, right? We're relating to the whole person. And so this stance says, what are the ways that we can invite the whole person in? And so we do things like sensing interviews, right? Before we start any large scale systemic project, we do interviews with usually 35 to 50 people who care about the issue that we're going to talk about, and we do 2-hour interviews with them. We get their perspective all the way from when and where you born, to how does this issue show up in your life, to what do we not understand about this issue, and we get to know the folks in a really different way than simply asking them to a meeting to give their opinion about an issue, right? And so for me, those sensing interviews, at least in our work, are the first place we begin to shake loose our really rigid ideas about the issue or the people in the issue. And those sensing interviews reverberate almost always throughout the entire process we're in, because people get to meet people in a different way, people who are impacted by the issue in a different way than they ever have been. They begin to see them as whole people. And so then the decisions we make about the action we're going to take together, the relationships we're in with each other, are significantly different because we're letting people be their whole selves.
Yeah, and I think that rises up to like a team level as well. And look, what is the multiplicity we need to have within our teams to effectively do the work? And, if we're seeking to have an impact within a certain community or area or region or sector, like, our team has to reflect the people we're seeking to engage, the people we're seeking to have some kind of positive impact upon, Otherwise, it's highly unlikely that we're going to be trusted, because quite simply, people will trust people like them, And so there's this seeking multiplicity also, it enables our work to begin to start having an impact and be rooted in the needs of the people who we're working with or hoping to impact. So I think that's a big piece. I mean, we did a lot of engagement work here in Halifax, and we thought we were doing a fantastic job, and, with a new central library and all kinds of stuff. And then eventually someone, we had a kind of a great rhetoric around, reaching a broad demographic, and a buddy of mine pulled us aside and said, great job on the engagement, but you really only reached the white middle class of the city. But I think I know why. And I was like, why? And she's like, well, that's because that's your team. And sure enough, we looked at our team, and there's like 5 white, bright middle class entrepreneurs go and get engagement done, And so I think this kind of like this seek multiplicity is all levels all the time too, right? That it's in the individual, up to the team, up to our organizational spaces.
And just to say that the seeking multiplicity, Joshua, that sense of urgency that you talked about earlier, for me, that sense of urgency can absolutely undercut our seeking multiplicity. So we have to be careful about it, right? Because we think it's too, when things feel urgent, when they feel life or death, we are so much more likely to kind of put people in their perspectives or the identities or the representation, and not let them be whole people that could help us move our work forward together. And so I think the urgency for me absolutely drives the shared work, and it can be a real danger to some of these things, like seeing ourselves as whole people, right? And so just to say, just so your folks have some context, this particular picture is a protest in Brazil. They've been protesting for days. The soldiers had guns. There had been violence. And this soldier said, please, not today, not on my birthday. And so the protester came and brought him a cake, right? Just today, you're not the soldier. Today, you're a guy who has a birthday, right? And those are high stakes. And often in high stakes situations, we think we can't unclench from how we see each other or what we think the work is. And I think in the high stakes situations, it's even more necessary. Our urgency makes it more necessary to see the whole people if we're going to move forward.
Right. And it's important to say it's not about sacrificing the urgency, right? Because there are some very urgent issues in the world right now. 3 years, get carbon out of the atmosphere, right? But it's like, how do we work in that tension between, you know, the need for urgency and the need to be engaging the critical voices, so we're designing systems, programs, projects, infrastructure that's rooted in the real needs of people, right?
Last one, Tim, you want to take us home?
Sure. So, I mean, I just feel like ignore power at your peril, right? So like hierarchy, gender, race, they're all playing out all the time. And so I think it's like, if I'm not interested in power for power's sake, but I'm interested in power that is moral, that is right, and that is good. I love that. And so there's some fundamental piece here of like, what if we ignore the power structures in the world, we're not going to be able to deliver effectively on our work, right? And you know, we're often working with like highly collaborative processes that like set people up in circle, or like, you know, are getting people engaging across multiple different perspectives. But just because we are working with a collaborative process doesn't mean that suddenly we're in an equitable space. It means we get to practice equity with each other. We get to practice being in a different quality of relationship that begins to move up and down and transcend the hierarchy, but it doesn't disappear. And so we have to be very deliberate about engaging. And so we were talking earlier about engaging in those hierarchical structures. And so, you know, a lot of the work that I do early on when I'm engaging in the project is looking at who has the power and influence in the circumstances we're in, and how are we engaging with that power and influence to create the conditions to support our long-term work being able to succeed. Like, and so quite literally, you know, what are the parameters that surround the work? What can we change and influence, and what can we not? And what is the level of support we can depend on as we move forward? And so if we haven't done that, we run a high risk that what we're going to do later on is going to get undermined, right? So I think there's a piece of this that is highly strategic, right? Like, we have to engage with the reality of it, and on some level demands that we sacrifice our ideology, right? But we're all equal, right? To sacrifice our ideology for the sake of moving our work forward, and doing that deliberately in the face of an often very unjust circumstance in a very unjust world. Choose.
Yeah, you just made me think of like yes, we may need to sacrifice our ideology, but never our integrity, right?
Like, lovely. Yeah.
Both of those things are true. Like I'm at a point in my life where like I'm ready to throw ideology out the window. I hope I can be guided by my personal integrity and compass, but like my ideas about power, like that's been for me in collaboration one of the things that has been the most challenged, right? Who am I willing to collaborate with? How am I willing to think about them? What, you know, so I think when we talk about power matters, it's everything that Tim said. And then it's asking us to push ourselves even more. Don't paint power with a broad brush. There are different kinds of power, number one, right? Like when we say power, like, you know, there's so many different kinds of power, and we need to understand that power isn't something simple, that it's complex and nuanced, and we have to be strategic about it. And also, often those of us of goodwill have great ability to engage across and even down in power, but engaging up as if the folks in power don't have any legitimate needs or rights or concerns, I think is another one of our real shortfalls. And so when I think about engaging, I'm thinking about like, how do I engage up? How do I engage across? How do I engage down? And when I'm talking about levels of power and influence, and then how do I begin to see kind of an ecosystem of need that we can respond to and be smart about power, right? But not to paint with such a broad brush. Those in power do, or those in power are, or those without power are. It's asking us to always have power in mind, but to bring a bit of sophistication and rigor when we talk about power and not paint with a broad brush.
Right, and like, let's be straight. Like, power has been wielded with an enormous lack of integrity. I mean, at least in my life, you know, my personal life, and then as I watch the news, and so this call to power in some ways can be quite disturbing, you know, because so much of the narrative and story I've carried is that, you know, power is something that cannot be trusted, right? But that narrative also means that I never truly trust the power that is within myself, right? Because if I carry that narrative about the world, I'm sure is for sure carrying it about myself too. So I think a lot of this you know, back to that levels work, right? Of like, how do I really get comfortable in my own power? Like, can I truly begin to trust my own power and my own integrity in relationship to it to go get the work done? You know, can I get in touch with the CEO in me and be comfortable with that? And can I act with integrity in that? And so I think thinking about that Martin Luther King quote that's on the slide in the context of that, right? That, you know, the kind of challenges that we're faced with in our communities and our families and our organizations are going to demand we all step into our own power, are already demanding that we all step into our own power, right? And move through our fear of it from having seen it wielded so incompetently for so long.
And finally, you know, we have these 5 stances, but there's a practice that underlies all of these stances, and that's the practice of grace, and that's just the practice of allowing ourselves and others to be human and make mistakes. You know, as we go into complex issues, as we want to work together over time, as we have this amazing sense of urgency pushing us along to do something different with our systems, we have to know that we're going to make mistakes. We individually are going to make mistakes. We as groups of folks are going to make mistakes. And so we need to have a practice. One of our friends calls this the mother practice, right? We can't have relationship as resolution. We can't stay in inquiry unless we're willing to be graceful and accept that we will make mistakes, right? And to have grace with each other and with ourselves. So often grace looks like, sometimes folks like feel like grace is all outward. I need to, you know, have grace with my colleague who offends me or hurts me, and that's true. But I found that often where we're the least graceful is with ourselves, and forgiving ourselves for making mistakes and not being perfect and not knowing how to do this work. And not having grace with ourselves, and we, you know, all sorts of behavior flows from that, defensiveness and reactivity and all of those things. And so these happen to be three leaders I know that I've just seen be incredibly graceful under pressure, and things come at them and they handle them with grace. They're clear, they're firm, they've got great boundaries. It's not letting someone step all over you. That's not what we're talking about with grace. What we're talking about is a deeper practice that actually, that I think leads to our liberation, right? I think we cannot have liberation unless we're graceful with ourselves and each other. And I see it as a liberatory practice. And I think that it's underlying all that we've talked about today. So I always like to say, grace doesn't mean people get to treat you any old way, right? It just means that we get to allow ourselves and other people to be human and make mistakes. So, yeah, I think for me, I don't want to give it too short a shrift because I think it's actually an incredibly important practice, and I've seen it be what saves a group and helps them be together over time, right? All these other stances, all the work in the center, sometimes what keeps us together is our willingness to be graceful with each other. And so grace, I just want to name, also has a real Judeo-Christian connotation. And I just want to name that when I'm with other groups of folks, they find other words for it. Some folks call it medicine. Some folks call it, like, so there's lots of ways. We all have this idea of understanding that we can be more graceful with each other, but please don't get hung up on that particular word.
Choose, can you just make the distinction between grace and forgiveness for us?
Yeah, I mean, forgiveness has all sorts of baggage, right? Forgiveness seems to be, a process of, it's okay, whatever you did is okay, or I happen to forgive you for it. No, that's not an evolved sense of forgiveness, right?
Right.
But grace is, I can see you and understand what you are and see your mistakes, and I can forgive you or not, but I can stay in it with you, and I can just understand that that's part of being part of the human condition. Right. Grace doesn't necessarily have to be forgiveness. It may come that way, but for me, it's just like a deeper practice. It's not about the transgression. It's about how I'm willing to be with you and how I'm willing to be as a person. And that's why it's liberation. Do you want to say anything else about that, Tim?
No, that's great. Thank you.
So here's the model, just one more time. With what we went through, we're a little short on time, but again, shared work, 5 stances around it. All of this rests in grace, and it's about taking the next step together. What can we do together?
Well, I really appreciate getting to explore these questions with you for sure. And one of the living the questions with you through the model that it arises to me is just to simply say, that it feels like today in a complexifying world, we've been passed a torch, sort of an evolutionary torch on all these levels all the time. And so to be able to explore and not have the answers, but live the questions with you both is a really great honor that I really appreciate. And you just had a quote on there too, so I don't want to miss that, but yeah.
I left it up there long enough for people to read. I can put it up again if you want.
No, I think people saw it. Joshua, I really appreciate I love that. Feels quite evocative to me that we've been passed an evolutionary torch that is now kind of ours to carry. I think that's true, and I think it's our mandate now to figure out what to do with that torch and how to live into a better world, right? And hopefully shared work will be part of that, or if it's useful for folks, they can use that. But I think the deeper mandate of we've been passed a responsibility and let's take care of it. Let's get to it.
Day by day.
Yeah.
Get into it. Well, thank you very much, both of you. It was wonderful to get to explore the model and also the stances. And I really look forward to continuing to do that with you both here on the border and around the world. So again, thank you very much.
Would love that. Thank you.